Well, Mary Frances, thanks so much for doing this with us.
Happy to be here.
So grief is obviously something that everybody experiences at some point, but we don't always understand maybe the science behind it. Can you walk us through what happens in our brains when we lose someone?
So grief is just the natural response to loss. It is how our brain, our mind, our body reacts when someone we're bonded with, someone who's deeply important in our life, is gone. And we think of ourselves as rational beings with a single line of thought. But in the brain, there actually can be multiple streams of information. After a loved one dies, we have two streams of information, what I call the gone, but also everlasting theory. And so that is, on the one hand, you know they're gone, and on the other hand, it just feels like they're going to walk through the door again, right? They are everlasting. We keep picking up the phone to call them. And then we think, oh my goodness, I've lost my mind. I've gone crazy. But really, it's just the brain trying to reconcile these two ways of understanding the world.
More and more people are turning to AI to stay connected to loved ones that they've lost, talking to an AI version of them, hearing their voice again. Yet some of these products will let people pre-record their voices or texts or personal stories so that loved ones can interact with an AI version of them later on. You've heard of people doing this?
Absolutely. I've spoken with a number of scientists and journalists about this.
For some people, this, I think, feels like a lifeline. For other people, maybe especially people who haven't experimented with this, it feels maybe kind of unsettling. From a psychological standpoint, what do you think are the benefits of this technology?
You know, the experience of grief is so universal. Every period of history, every culture in the world, when a loved one dies, we experience grief. But the expression of that grief looks so wildly different, right, at each moment in history. You know, when photography became available to people in Victorian era, people would take a photo of their deceased loved one after they died and then put that photo up on their living room wall. Now we would think, oh my gosh, that sounds so morbid. Why would you have a photo of the deceased person? But for some of them, it might have been the only photo they had, right? So technology has always affected then the way that we interact with our memories of the deceased loved ones. And I can understand that AI is a whole new level of getting to have a conversation with the person, you know, sometimes even in their own voice, depending on what, you know, material is used to create the avatar of our deceased loved one. What we know from research is that the chance to have closure conversations, a conversation where you get to say, I love you and I forgive you, or please forgive me, or I'm so grateful, or even just goodbye. We know that those conversations can be very comforting after a loved one has died and really impact the grief of the surviving person. You know, psychologists have long used what we call the empty chair, the opportunity to talk to the other person, to really think about what they would have said and how you would have responded. And in my mind, the opportunity to do that using, you know, not an empty chair, but to use the avatar could be very therapeutic. We don't have any scientific studies of that yet, but it would sort of follow on from what we know about getting to have closure conversations, that people could find that useful in understanding what has happened. You know, as a scientist, I can't help but want to have some data, right, about how people are using them over time. What I find fascinating is how long people will persist in using them. So what we know is that grief doesn't go away. Rather, we restore a life around the fact that our loved one is gone. And so I'm very curious, as people's life grows and that grief becomes less central, whether people will end up using the technology less over time, And if they do or if they don't, what does that mean about how helpful it is to use the technology, if you see what I mean? Because I think there is a danger in the technology as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask, I think it's been normal for a long time if you lose someone to listen back to old recordings of them or to talk to them out loud as if they were there, although that's obviously a one-way conversation. But it sounds like what perhaps is different with AI is the opportunity for that to be sort of an ongoing conversation, an ongoing habit that you build.
This is an interesting question as well. So, as a scientist, I really like to look at the data. So, a graduate student of mine a few years ago did what we call a daily diary study. So each day for 14 days, these were people who had their spouse had died. And so we asked them each day, about how their grief was and what did they do and did they interact with their deceased spouse? And we just sort of left it at that, open to interpretation. And the first thing to know is that most of them did report that they had interacted with their spouse. The range of ways that people described that was very wide. But think about it this way. If I ask you right now, to think about your partner, you can probably conjure a pretty visceral sort of experience of, what it would be like to hug him and so forth. You're able to do that in your mind when they're alive, and you're able to do that after they're deceased because it's all still encoded in your brain. So the question is, does it make sense to keep having these conversations, as it were? And, such wonderful ways of putting it. One of the young widows told us that when she would get in her car to drive home from work, it felt like her husband was DJing what came on the radio.
I love that.
Right? So it was like a real-time experience of sort of interacting with him. Oh, he loves this song. Of course he would play this, So in the data, what we saw was in the first 18 months or so, on the days that they said that they interacted with their deceased spouse, were days that they were having more grief. But what's interesting is, over time, it was the days they interacted with their spouse that they had less grief. And so the idea that we have to have, grieving is a learning process, that eventually we transition to, I can find comfort maybe in these conversations, if that's something that works for me. I can find comfort with them. I can figure out how they fit in my life now. And that I can adjust with that transformation, what we call continuing bonds. So I think it's not a one-time answer. I think how we interact with our deceased loved ones changes over time.
Yeah. Yeah, the spouse example especially makes me sort of wonder, too, if you have a relationship with an AI facsimile of a deceased spouse or loved one, does that potentially change how you form relationships with living people in your life going forward? And is that a risk, maybe?
So, most of us are surprisingly resilient, as difficult as loss is, and I mean really painful, tragic loss. Most of us do restore. I mean, the evidence shows in the data that the majority of us do actually develop and restore meaningful lives for ourselves where grief is not our central experience. There are a very small proportion of people, maybe 1 in 10 bereaved people, who go on to develop prolonged grief, that you don't see change over time, that the waves of grief are just as intense and frequent as they were when the loss first happened, even more than a year and 2 years and 3 years after a loss. So in the research, we've been thinking a lot about, well, what's different? Why does one group of people adapt and the other group seems just, there's no change, Why is this happening? Some of it has to do with how we interact with the deceased, and a lot of it has to do with how we interact with our living loved ones. So, for example, loneliness and isolation increases the chances that we will have more grief, because we all need support and care as we're dealing with this incredibly stressful loss. We need to feel connected to other human beings. And so it's interesting, in some of our data, what we see is people who have prolonged grief are often very avoidant of living loved ones and even of strangers. And of course, those are the people who, in the long term, we could also develop those loving bonds with that will make life feel connected and meaningful and make us feel joyful and compassionate.
Interesting. You have also studied how grief can affect memory. And I wonder if somebody is regularly interacting with an AI version of a loved one, especially because we know that nature of AI is that it's creative. It's sort of inventing new things and ideas. Could that change or distort how somebody remembers their loved ones over time? And would that matter?
Well, I think there's two parts really in this question. One has more to do with AI, and the other has more to do with our memories. So it turns out that our memories change over time, whether there's AI or not. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. So I can say the part about memory in this way. My mother died when I was 26 years old, which is not as young as, unfortunately, some people experience, but was pretty early in my life. And when I was in my 40s, I realized that my friends were having this sort of very different relationship with their moms, you know? They suddenly seemed really kind of understanding of their moms and kind of really grateful and so forth. And I realized that I wasn't necessarily getting the opportunity to have that experience when you have children of your own or you're working and you sort of see the context in which your mom was doing the things she was doing as you were a kid. And then I realized over time that I was having that experience with my mother, that I did actually feel more grateful to her and that I was less angry with her about things she had done. My relationship with her was evolving because I was evolving. And this is the nature of the continuing bonds, is that we're transforming them over time as we become different people. So it means I had new grief at times when I realized, oh, we're not getting to have these conversations now. But at the same time, my relationship and my memories, I was suddenly, without being an angsty young adult anymore, I was able to access many more positive memories of her as well that were there, but I wasn't necessarily reflecting on. So memory how we interact with memory changes over time. But the other thing I will say is, I think we have to be cautious how we think about AI. AI is just an algorithm, right? It feels so real because, if we can see human faces in toast, we're pretty good. We're pretty good at overlaying a human sentience on anything, right? And so what I think we have to remember is that the AI is always hallucinating its answers to us. It doesn't only hallucinate when we don't like the answer and we say, oh, AI made a mistake. It's actually hallucinating all the time. And we're just interpreting the responses that we got that made sense to us. It's not so different from going to an astrologer, right, who gives you some important feedback and you take that in and you use that in your life because it makes sense to you, because we're going to find a way to make sense of almost anything as human beings. So I think the cautionary tale there is making sure that we're not assuming the AI means that our loved one is living and transforming in their experience of the world, because they're not having an experience of the world. So anything that is changing in our relationship with that AI avatar is happening in our mind.
Just sort of at a core level, do you think that grief is something that humans should be trying to solve for with technology?
I'm very stuck on what it means to solve grief. So, as I said earlier, grief doesn't have an end. Your deceased one is always gone. And when you have that moment where you're aware of it, you will have a wave of grief. because you are bonded to them. You love them and they're not here and you're going to have grief. So if what you mean by solve is looking for a moment where we don't have grief, that is unlikely to happen regardless of the solutions we seek.
Do you have ethical concerns around the sort of development of these kinds of AI grief tools? I'm wondering specifically, like, do we worry that this is a vulnerable population that perhaps companies could seek to profit from by offering them this kind of technology?
Well, I mean, as we say, if you're not paying for something, then you are the product, right? So the idea here is if we have hundreds of thousands of bereaved people who are telling us what they ask their deceased loved ones in their most private moments, companies then know what is motivating us in a very deep and possibly subconscious way that can be used to modulate how products are offered to us and what slogans are used that we might find very motivating. They are profiting from a very deep scientific, algorithmic way of understanding human nature, which we might feel like in the context of science is very useful, but we might find in the context of consumerism very worrying.
Yeah. For listeners who are grieving or who have thought about experimenting with this AI chatbot technology to recreate a loved one or revive a memory of a lost loved one, what do you think folks should consider before perhaps diving in to this world?
As with most human decisions, I think the best thing is to talk about it with people who know you and love you and care for your well-being, and probably a range of people who have different views on technology, but also a range of people who have different understandings of grief. I think, this is not so different from what we do in grieving in general. Do I sell my house now that my husband has died? It's too big for just me, but all my memories of him are in it. This is a conversation to have with your children and your friends and your neighbors to try and figure out what is the right thing for you, to try to understand what's your motivations for and against doing this, and to keep those lines of communication open. Sharing our experience means we all make better decisions in the end. It gives us an opportunity to see things in a different way. And so thinking of having a big toolkit of ways of addressing grief, and if AI is one of them, then thinking about how common should that tool be in your toolkit? And as you move through it, is it helping or hurting in the short term and in the long term for you and for the people you are grieving with?
Well, Mary Frances, thank you so much for doing this.
This was a wonderful conversation, Claire.